So thanks so much. It's really quite an honor to be here, and I really appreciate being able to give this distinguished lecture and to see old colleagues and friends in the economics department as well. So today I'm going to be talking about research I've been doing on the internet and the news media. I should actually reinforce the disclaimer that I have been consulting for Microsoft, so in a few cases there'll be things that sort of relate to Google and what's happening on the internet, so you should just take the disclaimer that, that I have worked with Microsoft. Now, they've been really lovely to provide me with a lot of the data that I use for my research. I've been very interested since I started working on the internet in how people find information and the role that intermediaries play. And so, you know, we can kind of go back to the 1990s where we were very concerned, and I was very concerned at the time about that, you know, Microsoft was trying to pick your browser for you and they were going to pick your media player. And so being the intermediary or the operating system sort of gave them an opportunity to really determine what kinds of products that you use. And in the browser wars, Internet Explorer won because of Microsoft's position in the operating system. Then as we sort of got into the 2000s and the internet really became a great source of information, internet search became a really important intermediary between us and the things that we find, that we can find out there. And so it's worth just sort of pausing, you know, to think about what economists sort of thought the internet was going to do and what actually happened. So when the first books and articles that economists wrote about the internet were like, we were just so excited because it was going to bring us sort of one step closer to that ideal frictionless market where, you know, you could compare prices and you could have anything you want, and it was really going to be easy to search and find things. And so, you know, prices would be marginal cost and the world would be sort of very competitive and efficient. But sort of what we weren't really thinking about, probably because we were a little bit too much in our ivory towers, is how the explosion of information and opportunities was actually going to far outpace the decline in search costs. And so in fact, the role of intermediaries to help us find stuff was going to be more important. You know, so it used to be the news you would read would be determined by, you know, your local news, physical newspaper, your evening news reporters. They would sort of decide what information you got, and maybe, you know, the shopping mall would determine, you know, which shops you got to go to. But, you know, and so your information was curated that way. But on the other hand, there's sort of lots of shopping malls around the country and lots of newspapers. What's happening as information gets out there on the internet is, on the one hand, you can find so much more than your local guys ever could have possibly showed you. But on the other hand, the problem of actually finding all of that has gotten harder. And it actually has become more concentrated as a result. Because building a search engine takes billions of dollars, you're not going to have very many of them. And because those search engines get better the more data they have, even if you in principle have enough revenue to support multiple search engines, you're probably going to have a lot of concentration, maybe one or two. And so when we go out to think about news, it's the same sort of thing where it can be very difficult to try to go out and search all the different places you could find news, and so people increasingly rely on news aggregators or Facebook or Twitter to help them find things. And so the real kind of thing to keep in mind is that you're never actually going to get to a news article because you chose it directly. You never type in a URL with 100 characters into your browser bar. The only way that you're actually going to get news is because somebody offered it to you. Either the editors on the front page of the internet homepage, if you're reading it online, or your friends on Facebook, or your friends on Twitter, or the Google search engine, or a news aggregator. But those are really the only ways that you're actually going to get to content. You're not going to just find it by yourself because you don't know even what all the addresses would be of all the content that's out there. So there's a huge role for people to determine sort of what you read. And one thing I learned with search engines and sort of doing experiments there is that when you design a web page or you choose the order in which you put things, you have a huge impact on what people read. So if you take something from the first position in the search engine and you put it in position 3, it loses half of its traffic. right there. If you take it to the bottom of the page, it's going to basically hardly get any traffic at all. And so the people who are designing and curating what you read have an enormous amount of power. That's going to affect what gets created. So this is sort of the theme of a lot of my research, is what's the role of these aggregators and intermediaries, and how does that affect what information people get, and therefore what gets produced ultimately. One other thing to keep in mind that I'm not going to actually talk about today, but this is becoming even more important in the world of mobile. So, it used to be you would do some online shopping on your PC, but you also would go out and do physical shopping. Now that we're all carrying around our mobile devices, we're going to look at the map and see what's nearby. And so what gets shown to us on the map is going to help determine where we actually shop. The wallet, the credit cards are moving on to the phone. And so you're also going to have your mobile phone getting between you and basically all the purchases that you make. So there's going to be this expanded role of intermediaries in our society as we move forward. And the same kind of phenomenon is going to occur where there's a lot of control by the intermediary and also a lot of concentration. We're not going to have more than 2 or 3 large mobile platforms. Okay? So let me talk now specifically about the news media. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the theory of how the internet, things that the internet has done, affects the advertising that news media gets. After all, what do news media do when we think of them as consumers as being in the news business, but they're actually in the business of matching users and advertisers. That's the business model of news. They create content in order to sell your eyeballs to advertisers, and if that gets less effective, they get less profitable, they fire all their reporters, and we don't get a lot of news created. So some facts, media is under a lot of pressure. There's a big decline in advertising revenue. One way they used to make a lot of money was through classified ads, and that was just because of the delivery mechanism. A newspaper was getting delivered to your doorstep, and so it was a convenient way to deliver classifieds. That's all gone away with Craigslist and so on. And web ad revenue has been low, and so what we're worried about is the loss of good journalism, local newspaper bankruptcies, and also these trends of the rise of alternative ways to get news, which also compete with the traditional news media. So this is sort of the chart of doom. So this is what the newspaper ad revenue in 1980 dollars. This is adjusted for inflation, and it shows that sort of right around the time that the internet got popular, newspaper ad revenue kind of fell off a cliff. And so it's not surprising that a lot of them have gone under. So we can say, well, maybe that has something to do with the economy, but it's also fallen off a cliff as a share of GDP. And it's not just circulation. So if you kind of normalize for how many papers are sold, you've also seen a decline in ad revenue. So, what do people say about this? Well, one kind of observation is people say, well, gosh, in the print world, I had a certain number of pages and there was a finite amount of inventory. But in the online world, there's an infinite number of web pages, and so, gosh, like supply and demand, the prices go to zero. Now, that by itself is actually kind of a dumb remark if you think about it as an economist for a second, because there can be zillions of web pages, but actually you only have a certain amount of time in your day to look at ads. So actually attention is still scarce. And advertisers still want to get attention. And in fact, I won't go into as much today, but in some of my other research, I've looked at how the technology of advertising has improved that could actually make the advertising more productive, like with targeting and so on. So it seems like that's not just the fact that there's lots of web pages that's causing the problem, so we want to think a little bit more about actually how the market has changed. Now, there's also advertising challenges that are out there that are still there. So, for example, there's this infamous quote in advertising from decades ago, "I know that half my advertising dollars are wasted, I just don't know which half." And so there's a problem with advertising that it's really hard to measure how effective advertising is, so that's one problem. And another problem is that on the internet, people are kind of fickle. They're flitting from place to place. They're not actually engaging with one newspaper all day long and really spending a lot of time with it. So the little theory model that I've worked on with a couple of collaborators tries to understand the implications of two specific facts in what the internet has done. One is that the internet has made it much easier to go from outlet to outlet. And I'm going to show you a bunch of research later that really dives into the way in which that happens, but just as a first fact, like if you use Google News or some sort of news aggregator, you go to all sorts of different newspapers. So you're really not very loyal at all to any one online newspaper. And the second problem is that it's actually, even with today's technology and all the spying that everybody's doing on you and all the cookies and everything else, it's still actually pretty hard to keep track of whether or not you've actually seen a particular ad. We call this imperfect tracking. So just to, here's a little bit of fact about switching. I looked at different deciles of news consumption, so people who consume a lot of news or people who don't consume so much news, and then tracked on this x-axis here how much they use news aggregators, and on the y-axis how concentrated their browsing is. And so you see that the more they use aggregators, the more dispersed their browsing is, the lower the concentration. And so some evidence about the problems advertisers have tracking. So ComScore, which is a big research firm that sort of tracks hundreds of thousands of people and everything they do online, did a custom analysis for me to try to look at, they looked at 30 big advertising campaigns, and basically what advertisers want to do is they want to hit somebody a certain number of times. So advertisers believe that you want somebody to see between 3 and 8 ads, and that's effective. If they see your ad more than 8 times, it's just duplicative and it kind of starts to annoy you. If you only see it once or twice, you're not going to remember it. So they're trying to hit for this sweet spot, and so they tried really hard using all of the best technology to plan big campaigns and hit everybody between 3 and 8 times using cookie tracking and so on, but they failed. Over half the impressions that they served actually went too few or too many times. So this is just evidence to say that advertisers actually have a very hard time keeping track of what people are doing as they move around the internet. And again, actually I should just mention, we're kind of used to, as consumers, sort of thinking about advertisers as bad. We forget that if we like reading news, then actually advertisers are good because they're the ones who are paying for it, right? So if the advertisers are inefficient, then they're not going to pay as much and we're not going to get as much news. So, what's going on and why do I think these things I've highlighted for you can be partly responsible for what's going on with newspapers? Well, in the old world, you might live in Boston or you might live in Washington and you read a newspaper, and so then you've got a newspaper that goes, the newspaper advertising platform that gets between you and the advertisers. And if you wanted to reach like everybody in a metropolitan area, it's actually was not that many options to get there, and so the newspapers actually had this sort of monopoly over their users. Once a set of users is subscribed, then the newspaper platform can go out and charge high prices to advertisers. And in fact, the regulatory agencies for years were preventing newspaper mergers exactly because they thought the newspapers were exploiting monopoly power over the local advertisers. You would go to the advertiser and say, hey, if you want to sell car ads, the only way to get on everybody's table is to be in my newspaper on Sunday morning, so you got to pay up. So this was, sad for the advertisers, good for the newspapers. They made lots of money and they did lots of investigative journalism as well. So there's a few problems, though, with this kind of model as description. For example, we've seen a lot of evidence that competition does actually reduce ad prices. So in this model, one of the features is that basically the advertisers just get charged really high prices, but there's really no competition for the advertisers across the newspapers because the newspapers have completely segmented audiences. So they each charge monopoly prices for access to their newspapers, their readers, but this is not actually what you see in practice. We also see things like, for-profit outlets don't like it if public broadcasters would be allowed to show ads, which is also evidence that there's actually competition in practice. And finally, one really important fact out there is that larger outlets almost always earn higher ad revenue per consumer. So our model tries to take this and say, well, what happens when you go online? What we're going to see is that instead of the old world where people would read one newspaper or the other, now they're going to read multiple news outlets. They might spend the same amount of time, but they're going to divide it. And so what does that mean in terms of competition? Well, first of all, the competition for the users is generally going to mean that you don't charge the users anymore. And second, now the advertiser actually has two different places they can reach that user. So now you've created competition in the advertising side of the market. And so the question is then, will the advertisers continue to go to multiple outlets, or will they actually specialize and try to go to only one outlet? And of course, what's going to happen to the money? So we can think about the advertiser's problem. What they could do is when a consumer is going to come to outlet one, if Starbucks could put up an ad in the morning on the newspaper's website and catch that consumer. And then Zipcar could come in the afternoon and catch that consumer with a different ad. But the problem is that what if that consumer actually goes to the other outlet? And so the big problem the advertiser has is that if they only go to one outlet, they might actually miss the consumer. If they're on in the morning and the consumer only comes in the afternoon, they don't catch them. But on the other hand, if they advertise on multiple outlets, then they're going to catch the same consumer twice. So they have a choice: either they specialize and they miss some people, or they generalize, go to multiple outlets. But then the average value to the advertiser is smaller because sometimes they're hitting people twice. So the main results of the theory that happens once users are switching is that switching is going to increase competition and lower prices, but there's a second effect which reinforces the lower prices. And that is that some advertisers actually decide to give up on advertising on multiple outlets. And why is that? Well, if you have high-value advertisers like a car advertiser, then they're going to find it worthwhile to pay at a given price even if they're wasting impressions, because they really, really value reaching users. So even though I'm going to hit people twice, the value to me as a car advertiser is greater than the market price. But if you're an advertiser that has a lower value, you're selling something that's less worthwhile, then at that price, you're going to say, gosh, if I advertise on multiple outlets and I waste some impressions, the average value including waste is less than the price. So I'm not going to want to do that. But if I advertise on just one outlet at a time, then I'm not going to waste anything. I'll miss some consumers, but the ones I get, at least, the value will be greater than the price because I know I'm not duplicating. So you're going to see advertisers basically reduce their demand. They're not going to try to advertise everywhere because of this waste. And the waste is coming from the inability to keep track of how many times people see your ads. And so then this theory is going to say something about what happens in the market. First of all, you can think about what happens if you have blogs that come out there. And the thing about blogs is if they take away your readers as a newspaper, that's bad. You lose readers. But on the other hand, that could be good for advertising prices because people are spending time on something that doesn't show ads. So they could be good for outlets as long as they're stealing somebody else's readership and not yours. Aggregators are going to have a similar effect that like Google News doesn't show a lot of ads or doesn't show any ads. But on the other hand, they're going to increase switching. And the more people switch, the less efficient advertising is, and also the more small advertisers give up on advertising on multiple outlets, and so the prices fall. Another result is that something like Facebook that sees a lot of people once a day is going to command a premium in advertising prices. And that's because if you're going to choose just one outlet, you want to choose a big outlet so that you are going to reach a lot of people, not miss many people, and avoid waste. And so you see that the bigger you are, the higher advertising prices you can command. And what that means is that we're going to see more mergers of newspapers or information sharing among newspapers in order to keep advertising prices high. That also means that a paywall can have extra unintended consequences. So if you charge money to people for coming to your newspaper, you're going to make money on some people, but you're going to reduce your readership. But if your readership is small, then you're not going to be the outlet of choice for smaller advertisers. So you get a further hit beyond what you're expecting. So all of these things can sort of be accounted for by this change in user behavior when you're on the internet. Okay? So that's sort of some theoretical framework to think about, why switching and all of our fickleness on the newspaper matters. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about exactly how these aggregators affect what we read. So I went to this conference a couple years ago at the FTC. It was really one of the funnest conferences I've ever been to in terms of spectator interest. So I had Rupert Murdoch facing off against Arianna Huffington, and they really went at each other. So Rupert Murdoch, first of all, actually put up a fairly coherent economic argument. He says that aggregators steal our content. In particular, he says that when people take snippets of my content and put them on a website and I don't get any advertising revenue from it, that decreases my incentive to create the content. That is, and he's got a quote, he says, the truth is that the aggregators need news organizations. Without content to transmit, all of the TVs, computers, cell phones, and BlackBerries would be blank slates. To paraphrase a famous economist, there's no such thing as a free news story. Okay? We're not going to create news unless we get paid for it. And so if people are taking snippets of our news and creating something that looks like a news homepage, except they didn't actually pay to produce it, and I'm out there producing my hard-earned content and not earning revenue for it, I'm not going to produce it. But actually the best quotes from Rupert actually came in Arianna's speech, because Arianna herself had gone back and read all of Rupert's speeches and taken the highlights. So here's Arianna on Rupert. She says, so now the sites that aggregators and news have become, in the words of Rupert Murdoch, parasites, content kleptomaniacs, vampires, tech tapeworms in the intestines of the internet. Okay, I love this language. This is lots of metaphors for actually real economics, which is like, what is a tapeworm? It's sort of sucking off the host, but not actually going out and doing the work. So, this is actually a colorful way to give a real economic content. And he says, but hey, if you're a big brand like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, I think you should actually take your content off of Google News. And I think that my content is so important to Google News that they'll be hurt more than I am. So then Josh Cohen from Google got up and he says, no, you got this all wrong. What aggregators do is we help people find stuff. It's all about helping people find information. And he also says, well, it's very easy if newspaper, if you don't want to be listed on Google News, just tell us and we'll take you off. Of course, that's not a very helpful comment. If you're a small newspaper and you remove yourself from Google News, do you hurt Google News? No. There's all sorts of other newspapers who can provide the same content. All you hurt is yourself, because the people who go to Google News just won't come to you, and so you lose traffic. So there's no individual incentive for a news site to come out. And Arianna closes up by saying that, we're not in Kansas anymore, Toto. This is just how the world works. Okay. So just summarizing the economics, we can say aggregators could be a substitute for the homepage of the newspaper. Google News homepage looks a lot like the New York Times homepage. And, personally, I go there instead of the New York Times homepage. For me, it's often a substitute. And in fact, only half of the people who visit Google News actually click through and visit a website. On the other hand, they can also complement newspapers because, indeed, Google's algorithms are really good at discovering things, and they highlight things that you might not have discovered otherwise. So in particular, I found that when Google News started putting up local content, when I lived in Boston, I always went to the New York Times. I never went to the Boston Globe. Who cared what the Boston Globe had to say? But, occasionally there would be something interesting, and so Google News would show it to me, and then I would go to the Boston Globe and read about it. And so in economic terms, the search costs for me of going to the Boston Globe were higher than my expected returns from the Boston Globe. But if somebody found it for me and put it in front of my face, on some days I would have wished I had gone, and indeed I would. So it increased my usage of the local websites. That's an example of complementarity. So for me personally, I've experienced both. Then, in principle, it's going to have a change in the composition of news consumption. It's going to decrease the concentration of browsing and make it much easier for you to find content on small niche outlets. And finally, there's a decline in the role of curation of the newspapers. Google's algorithms are going to be choosing news for you, telling you what's important by what people clicked on, rather than an editor and a journalist. So what I'm going to do is try to measure all of this using two what we call natural experiments. So the first one, actually, this results are hot off the presses. I was still producing graphs yesterday. This is something that happened in December 2014, and so I've just been pulling all the data, and I'll show you that. And basically what happened was, in Europe, you know, everybody's been much more anti-Google, partly because it's not a European company. And so in Spain, they actually got the legislature to pass a law that said Google was going to have to pay the websites if they used their news. And so Google turned around and said, fine, if that's what you're going to do, I'm shutting down. So they shut it down entirely. They shut down Google News. They threatened to take it out of search as well, but they didn't. But they might still. And a second example was the introduction of local news content in France in 2009. And it happened earlier in the United States, but I just the data gets anonymized and deleted, and I wasn't able to get the older data to study the US. And so what I'm going to be looking at, my data source is going to be microdata from people's internet browsing behavior. You know, the raw data is millions of people who've opted in to allow their data to be used for sort of research purposes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the changes in patterns of browsing and consumption, tracking how these individuals responded to these changes. So let me start with Spain. So I've got, Spain is a smaller country, makes the analysis a little bit harder, but I've got about 200,000 PC internet users who went online in at least 10 out of 11 weeks in a sample time I'm studied, and who viewed at least one news website prior to the Google News shutdown. So these are people who have some interest in news. And I'm going to look at you know, the week of the change, a couple weeks before and a couple of weeks after. And I'm going to ask questions about how users shifted their news consumption, which outlets gained, and ultimately, if we see who the winners and losers are of aggregators, that's going to help us predict how the news industry will change over time as these become more important. So this is the raw data for my overall sample of the news browsing. So on the x-axis, I have the dates. This vertical line is the date that they turned off Google News, and this is the news browsing. And so the first thing you notice when you look at this is that actually this is going to be a really hard thing to analyze because this is leading up to Christmas, and you can see that people were declining their news usage fairly strongly as you approached Christmas. I've also got this date, which I end up excluding from a lot of the analysis. This particular date, the Crown Princess Christina of Spain was indicted on corruption. It was a very big news day. And so people shifted their news consumption on that day, and they actually, as I'll show you a bit later, they used Google search a lot to help find the most recent news on that. But so just looking at this data, it's going to be sort of hard to tell exactly what happened as a result of the Google News shutdown. Some news reports came out right after this, and they said, oh my gosh, you know, the sky is falling, you know, the news, people aren't reading news anymore. But as you can see, that was really kind of part of a secular decline rather than something you could immediately attribute to the Google News shutdown. So if you actually look at our data and see, well, how big of an impact could this have? Here I've got the share of news, the share of page views that come from different referral sources. So what we do is we look at a sequence of news page views, and if they say they started on Google News and then they read 5 articles on the New York Times, I'm going to say that the referral source was Google News. Okay, if they started on Facebook and then they read 3 articles on, you know, the Washington Post, the referral source was Facebook. So if you see up here, the most common way of accessing news is direct navigation. Like you type in www.newyorktimes.com. That's how most people get to news. The next most common way is from internet search, like Google searches. And so down here, Google News, the green line, and here it is over here, it ends here. It's actually a very, very small percentage of news referrals, even if you give Google News credit for everything that you read after you got there. So in some sense, you know, it's really almost impossible that this is going to have a very large effect on the aggregate. So that's not really going to be an interesting question. But what we can do is say, well, okay, on this small subset of users, we're going to look at what the impact on them was. And that would tell us something about what would happen if, you know, a broader set of aggregators was shut down. And so the way we do this is we take the treatment group, are people that had at least one Google News page view in the couple of weeks before. And then the control group is going to be constructed. So for every user, we're going to put them in 20 buckets by how much news they read, and 20 buckets for how much they use the internet. So that's 400 buckets. So for every Google News user, I'm going to find a corresponding control user who's someone who had very similar characteristics in terms of their news. And as you can see, I'm plotting before the shutdown that the treatment group and control group, so the treatment is red, the control group is blue, their news behavior tracks each other very closely. Then after the shutdown, we see a big drop-off of the treatment group relative to the control group. So you took away Google News, which was something they like to use, and they read less news. That's the result. And it's roughly a 19% drop relative to the control group. Okay? And this is robust to alternative ways of cutting the data. So then we can ask, okay, well, so what do they do once they don't have Google News anymore? Where do they go? Do they shift to other portals that looked kind of like Google News? And we find that no, that's not actually what they do. So over here, this line here is direct navigation. So going directly to websites, and we see that they start going directly to websites. They also increase their internet search. So we see that even after the change, they look a little different than the control group. That is, they do more search and less direct navigating than the control group. So one thing we don't know is sort of whether that's because they're different people, like people who liked Google News like a lot of variety, or whether Google News had trained them to know a lot of different news websites, and so they kept going to a wider variety afterwards. And that's something that we really have a hard time telling in our data. So then one of the things that makes all of this interesting is we want to know what's going to happen to industry structure, like who's going to win, who's going to lose, whose profits decline. And again, everybody's on the verge of bankruptcy, so just a small decline in profitability can push you over the edge in this business. So we looked at the share of browsing to top 5, that's the red line, and top 20 news outlets for the treatment and for the Google News users and the non-Google News users. And so what we find is over the time period from the before to the after period, because of this holiday effect, the control group reduces its browsing, but the Google News users actually decrease their consumption of top 5 outlets by less. So what I would conclude from this is actually that getting rid of Google News, once you account for the time trend, is actually causing the big outlets to win. In other words, Google News was sort of stealing traffic from the top news outlets that produce content. And if you take Google News away, those big outlets, which are doing a lot of the investigative journalism, they're the only ones sending reporters to Syria or places like that, those guys are going to get more traffic and thus more advertising revenue. So Google News is hurting the top outlets and helping the longer tail. Now, if you don't like the top outlets and you think the long tail of news is really important for news diversity, then you might think that Google News was doing a good thing. If, on the other hand, you think that most of that long tail is sort of copying other people's content and they don't even have a journalistic staff and they're never going to go to do real in-depth reporting, then you might think this is bad. So I can't answer that question, but it's going to say something about industry structure and how it's going to change. And of course, I already told you that the advertising market side is also going to support top outlets and big outlets at the expense of small outlets. Okay. So we can look at, so this was the total amount of browsing. We can also look at the share of browsing. So what we see is when you get rid of Google News, the top 5 share from the Google News users goes up from about 27% to 38%, while there's only a small increase in that same share for the control group. So again, what it's showing us is that the Google News users read less news, but a much higher share from top outlets. And what that means is on aggregate, they're reading more top outlets. We can also say, how are you getting to those top outlets? What are the ways that allow you to get there? And we see that for these Google News users, they used to get the top outlets through Google News, but now they're going to get to the top outlets through search or through direct navigation. And there's not a lot of change in the other ways to get there. So again, the main thing that's happening is these people, when they don't have an aggregator, they use search or they go to big outlets directly. And we can see that there's not much change of what you do once you use a particular channel. So when you use search, your fraction of going to top outlets doesn't change. When you do direct navigation, your fraction of going to top outlets doesn't change. What changes is how much you use direct navigation and search. So the conclusions from Spain is that while this isn't really itself a big policy concern because Google News was just not that popular in Spain, search is much more important. We saw search as a huge referral source, and so we should be concerned about what Google does in search because they can pick winners and losers and really have a big effect on the profitability of media outlets. And then overall, we found that the effect of aggregators was to decrease news consumption, which is basically saying that for this set of users, actually, Google News made you read more news. So that's the positive part, the search and discovery part, that Google News is going to help you find stuff and make you be a more informed member of society. But it's going to really redistribute their browsing away, and Google News basically spreads you out relative to what you would do without Google News. And whether that's good or bad for society depends on, how important those different outlets are. So let me now show you, so the one big problem with all of this was the holiday effects were pretty pronounced. And so I'm going to show you another natural experiment that actually has kind of a different form. So this is when Google introduced the option to have local news in France. So before the change, you had a little box that would allow you to say, I'm interested in business or I'm interested in technology, and it would let you personalize the Google News homepage. After November 2, 2009, you were allowed to put in your location, and you could say, I live in Paris, and then I'm going to get Paris news. Okay? So then you're going to see on your homepage, you're going to see on a big chunk of the page will be devoted to Paris after you tell them you live in Paris. And so the reason this is a little bit of a different empirical exercise is that the user actually has to opt in. So the fact that they had to choose it is actually bad for me because the fact that they chose to do it makes them different. On the good side is that all the users are going to opt in on different dates. And so I don't have to worry about Christmas because they're all going to be hit at different times. So for this one, we find a similar way to get control users, but we're going to have a different kind of problem in a sense. With the Spain, I had the Christmas problem. Everybody got hit with Christmas at the same time, and everybody got hit with the princess at the same time relative to the change. Here, I'm going to have different dates, but I have a worse problem that the people, how am I going to know that I have a good control user for someone who actually typed in a location on the Google search bar? So nonetheless, we do our best. So we actually, in this paper, we have a much more complex matching algorithm where we look at, we want to find users. If we have a treatment user who put in their location to Google News, we find control users who lived in the same location and did the same things an hour before. So we have a very rich set of matching to try to make sure that our control users are really as much like the treatment users as they can be. And so here's just an example of what the results look like. So this is how much local news consumption people do. This red line is our synthetic control group. Our treatment group is going to have a big spike on day 0 because they all went to Google News. That's how they became a treatment user, because they went to Google News and they typed in their location on a day. And so what we're going to do is, again, day 0 for each user will be their adoption date. And we're going to find control users on that same day who had similar patterns the day before, the week before, the month before. And so we see we do a reasonably good job. The utilization looks similar for the days leading up to the date when the treatment users opted in. And then after the treatment users opt in, they read more local news. And so what that's saying is that, just going back to this picture, what could have happened is that I used to go to a Paris local newspaper. Now that Google has shown this to me, I don't have to go there anymore. I can just read about it on Google News, and I stop going to my local newspaper. And that is not what happened. What happened instead was that, in fact, they started reading more, going more to local newspapers rather than less. So that supports the search and discovery. And so overall, what we find is that this incorporation of this local content made people read Google News homepage more. It increased the consumption of local news. And actually, the non-local news also was lifted by the fact that people just liked the Google News homepage more. So getting this big block of really good content, which of course they didn't produce, but this good block of really good content made people like the product more. They went there more, they found more stuff, they read more news. So that really supports the guy from Google. He's saying, look, that's what we do. We find stuff for you. We help you discover, and then you become more informed. On the other hand, that's of course consistent with the results from Spain as well. When you took it away, they read less. But we also find the same kinds of results in terms of the patterns. We find a 16% increase in new outlets, a reduced share of browsing on old outlets, and a 20% reduction in the share of referrals that come from regular newspaper homepages relative to Google. So Google becomes more important in determining what you read and how you read it, and it's also redistributing people to smaller outlets. So same result, different example. Okay, so that's kind of the news aggregators, and that was sort of the thing that people were really excited about a couple of years ago and still are excited about in Europe especially. The last part I want to show you about is also some work in progress I have on social media and news consumption. So here we're trying to understand how does where you get your news affect what you read? So we already know that these aggregators make you more dispersed, but what else does it do? Does it make you more polarized? Does it make you read more personal articles? Do you read more research? You know, do you read more things that make you want to go out and do stuff? Like, how does the trend of people getting their information through these different aggregators and intermediaries affect the news you get? And so we can look at this from the user perspective. So we can say, you know, if I take the same user, how does what they read differ from where they go, depending on where they got the news? And I can also look at it from the outlet perspective. I can say, if I'm the New York Times, you know, how is the audience I'm getting from Facebook differ in their preferences from the audience I'm getting when they come directly? And if I see a difference, which you do, then is that just because all my young readers are coming through Facebook and all my old readers are coming through direct navigation, and it's not really because of Facebook per se, it's just that they're young and old? Or is it because people just read different stuff when they come from Facebook? So those are the kinds of questions I'm going to ask, and that's going to help us know what's going to happen if people use more and more social media, if more and more older people use social media, and they stop relying on the news homepages, which is then in turn going to tell us what are the newspapers going to produce for us. If everybody's coming from Facebook, are they going to shut down Syria and produce a lot of celebrity news or something like that? Okay. So this is also the same kind of browsing data where I watch millions of people reading news over time. I'm going to show you most of the results today are from 2 weeks in April 2013. And there's some problems with that if the sample's too short and too small. So some of my results are going to change. I've just finished collecting for 5 months ending in really January 2015, and I'll have those results soon. So I'll show you the short-term results with a caveat that those could change. And so what we do is we actually look not only at where people went, but we actually pull the text of what they read and try to look at the substance of what people are reading. So classifying articles, there's some things that you can do very simply. You can count the number of articles in the story and so on. But actually, we wanted to look at much richer stuff, like is this polarized? Is it conservative or liberal? Is it emotional? And so that's a much harder thing to do if I want to look at all the news people is reading, because people read a lot of stuff. And so I can't just hire a bunch of undergraduates to code it all. It's too much. So what we did was we tried to use some novel methods for categorizing the news and combine it with human coding. So what we do is we actually look out at all the articles and we try to find what those articles are about. And just to sort of jump ahead, roughly like 2/3 of my articles are going to be on about 200 topics in a particular 2-week period. And so we have a hierarchical way to do this. So it turns out Wikipedia is amazing, because anytime something happens, like Hillary Clinton's email scandal, I haven't looked, but there's probably a Wikipedia article about it by now. You know, as soon as something big happens, somebody writes about it on Wikipedia. And so for a bunch of articles, actually, I can just directly map them onto a Wikipedia article because they share lots and lots of words in common. And if they share lots and lots of words in common, then I'm just going to say, okay, this article is on the same topic as the Wikipedia article. But then some articles don't have a Wikipedia article. So some topics don't. So like there was a bunch of news in my sample period about Obama's prom night. For some reason, somebody posted a picture on social media about Obama's prom night, and a bunch of people wrote articles about it. So there's no Wikipedia article about Obama's prom night. But what I do for that is I actually construct a network of articles. So I take every article and every pair of articles, and I find out how connected are those two articles by how many words they share in common. So I just do this for 2 articles. That doesn't tell me very much. But if I have 50 articles, and they're all really connected with each other, and not so connected with other articles, then I'm going to say those 50 are all part of a group. This is called unsupervised learning in machine learning. And the type of algorithm is called a community detection algorithm. And it's often used for social networks, but I'm going to use it for the network of articles. And I'm going to say, here's a community of things that all seem really connected to each other. And then I can just read 5 of them, and I say, oh yeah, Obama's prom night. So I can name them myself, but the machine learning algorithm actually figured out that they were similar to each other. This is sort of like when they say, I found cats on YouTube. I found a bunch of videos that looked the same, and then I looked at them, and they were all cats. Okay, so I found a bunch of articles that were all really similar to each other, and I call them Obama's prom night. So these are some examples of the topics in this particular time period. So we had the marathon bombings, Ariel Castro kidnapping, death of Lee Rigby, the Benghazi attack was still getting a lot of press. So these are the kinds of things that my algorithm found. So now I can look at, so then what I do with these things is I can actually take these topics and I can ask human beings questions about them. Like I can say, is this potentially politically biased? And so, for example, the NCAA Men's Division I Basketball Championship, no, not politically biased. And so if I want to analyze political bias, I want to get those out of my sample. Why is that so important? Well, there's been some previous studies that have said, well, actually, people are really broad when they read online. When they look at internet browsing research, they say a lot of people go to Fox and they go to the New York Times. And so that means that everybody's getting a diversity of news sources when they read online. But the problem with that is that they might be reading about a tornado in Fox and about, Obamacare on the New York Times, or they might be reading about the Benghazi scandal on Fox, but reading about, the NCAA championship on the New York Times. And that's not really diversity. That's not really different perspectives. It's just that big news outlets, you just happen to go to them a lot if you want to find out stuff that's happening that has nothing to do with politics. So that's one of the reasons this is a really important thing to do. I can also ask, is this a topic that might be emotional content or things like that? And then if they are, then I can only then spend my money coding more details about the articles. So using that, I then use the same kind of data about browsing, and I try to ask questions about how you get to the news affects what you read. So just to start with, you find that social media has really difference in importance for different kinds of news outlets. So, for example, New York Times has a lot of social media referrals, but things like health.yahoo.net doesn't get a lot of social media referrals, and like BBC is sort of in the middle. So one of the first things we can do is come back to this sort of outlet size question we were looking at before and look at it through the perspective of now social media versus direct navigation. I've thrown the aggregators out. And so what this chart is going to show, first the red and blue bars, comparing the red and blue bars is going to say, how is the share different between social media referrals and direct navigation? So just for example, we see that for the smallest outlets, there's a much higher share of going to small outlets coming from social media relative to direct navigation. You very rarely navigate to the bottom 10% of outlets through direct navigation. And so just like aggregators, social media also spreads you out to many more tail outlets. The green bars do this exercise of trying to control for the user. So the exercise is, if I actually took into account the fact that there's different people on social media than coming through direct navigation, and I asked the question, the green says, if I had the same user mix in direct navigation as on social media, what would the numbers look like? And so if the green bar is the same as the blue bar, that's saying all the differences are due to user mix. Whereas if the green bar is different from the blue bar, that says the differences are not due to different people, but actually different behavior. And so we find here this small outlet difference is not accounted for. It's not that social media users like small outlets, it's that when a given person goes to social media, they're much more likely to be diverted to small outlets. And that kind of makes sense, again, because you don't remember the URLs for all the small outlets. Then we look at sort of what we call super topics, so collections of things, whether it's crime, politics, and so on. And we actually find there that a lot of the differences, not all of them, but a lot of the differences are not huge, and they're ones that look big to start with. So like it looks like there's a lot more crime on social media, but that actually is mostly accounted for by user mix. Then when I look at some aspects of content, I see some differences that don't actually get accounted for. So here I'm actually going to change my counterfactual. I'm going to think about now adjusting for mixes in the topic rather than differences in user. So I'm going to say, if the green bar is the same as the blue bar, that's going to say that differences between social media and direct navigation are due to differences in the topics that they cover. And that seems a more relevant counterfactual because you can imagine that like some things like sports might be less prone to have emotional content than other things. So I want to sort of control for the topics that they're looking at. So I find that social media is much more likely to direct you to articles that have an individual perspective and that assume background knowledge or that have useful information. And so that can sort of, that coincides with sort of your intuition on social media that people they're not going to just show you an informational article about a tornado, but they're going to share the article about the mom who was hiding in the basement. That individual perspective is something that's more of a social type of interaction than something that's just basically informational. We also see more in-depth analysis, more socially controversial or more controversial and one-sided stuff coming through social media. More opinion articles, more politically controversial, and more caring and supportive attitude articles. So social media, if this trend grows, you can then feed back and say, gosh, the newsrooms are also going to look at this data, and they're going to say, gosh, everybody, reporters go out and write more articles of this type. That's what people are going to want to. That's what's going to bring readers to our site from Facebook. We also can look at how targeted things are. So the idea is on social media, you might be trying to share things with people who are like you. So there's a bit more of sharing things that are interesting just to a specific group, like moms or sports fans or things like that. Things that are more targeted at women or parents on social media. We see not as much difference in terms of feeling strong emotion broadly, but we do see a pretty big difference in terms of positivity. And again, this is consistent with what news media tells me as well, that they want to write positive stories because people want to share positive stuff on Facebook. They want to share compassionate stuff on Facebook as well. So that, again, those are the instructions that go back to the reporter. So overall, we see that social media promotes small outlets. It's not necessarily promoting, crime at the expense of politics. But actually, it's changing the type of article, the way the articles are written. Really, the craft of journalism at its heart is going to get altered by this. Let me now just close up by giving a few things. This is kind of the sexiest part of it, if you like. How does social media increase political bias? So first of all, I've just stacked up the stack rank of top outlets and how whether they actually cover things that are even political at all. So of course, ohmygod.yahoo.com is not very political. But some of the other, even finance.yahoo.com is going to be covering, government finance things and so on that are more political. So just the propensity to be political varies across outlets. The second thing is that we can look at topics that people write about, and we can see that some topics have much more biased content than others. So school shootings, almost all articles about school shootings are liberal. Okay, like if somebody shoots somebody at a school, you're not going to, conservatives aren't going to want to write about that because that's like anti-gun. But if somebody gets shot in a school, then liberal outlets and liberal reporters are going to write lots and lots of articles because they believe that that's going to support their opinion. And so, the shooting of Trayvon Martin, that's very liberal. The Benghazi attack, all of those articles are conservative. So one of the findings out of this that's kind of interesting is that the way that Fox and the New York Times differ is going to not be so much that they have so much more slant conditional on a topic. It's just that Fox writes lots of articles about the Benghazi attacks, and the New York Times writes lots of articles about school shootings and Trayvon Martin. And so the bias comes out through the choice of topic. And so the influence of media is a little bit more insidious, that you tend to, if you read a specific outlet, you're going to think something's really important and you're going to know all about it, but you're not going to know so much about the others. So then we look at how social media affects what you read. And first, we just look at all users, and we compare neutral, this is conservative, and this is liberal, and we say, how does what you read on social media compare to what you read when you navigate directly? And we see generally that social media has less neutral content and more biased content, and it's not just accounted for by the topics that you cover. But these aren't huge effects. They're there, but they're not huge. But the idea would be that, no matter how biased they are, a liberal outlet or a conservative outlet is still not going to cover their entire page with biased articles. They're going to have some neutral articles on their homepage when they curate it, but your friends might not. So we get a much more extreme picture. Now we're going to get also a much smaller data set, which is a caveat here. But if I look at just people whose average reading is conservative, so if I score their articles by whether they're liberal or conservative, if I've seen someone read a conservative article, then basically they hardly ever read liberal articles anywhere they go, but they sure as hell don't read them coming from social media, and they read very little neutral news coming from social media as well. So if you're conservative, then almost everything you click on off of Facebook is conservative. And if you're liberal, everything you click on off social media is liberal. And so this is actually a much sort of scarier picture, if you like, of the role of social media in kind of political informativeness, because it's suggesting that if you are extreme, that social media is going to push you back in that direction. But I do want to say that for this, to really do this well, I need my 4 months of data, not 2 weeks, because people just don't read that much in 2 weeks. So in summary, I would just say social media is more biased than direct navigation. It's particularly striking for people who are already extreme. Outlets vary a lot in their audience and their coverage of topics. And again, some analysis I didn't show you supports the idea that political bias is more a function of topic than outlet. Like if you run a regression, if you put in topic effects, it sort of kills the outlet effects. So I actually can't statistically say that Fox is conservative after I control for what they cover. So that's kind of an interesting thing. It helps you think differently about the way people get their news. And there's sort of evidence in favor of the filter bubble, that your friends give you things that you like, and as you spend time on the internet, while you could read anything, you actually read more things that agree with you. So just in summary, a lot of differences in social media and direct navigation audience are due to users and topics, but not all. And over time, we might expect to see the outlets responding more and more to these trends. And I've certainly talked to a lot of media outlets, and they tell me about their plans, and they're watching the numbers more and more and instructing their reporters to respond to it. And they're also more and more getting, it used to be only the big outlets even had the computer systems to do targeting and personalization, but now those are being sold to either smaller media outlets, and they're all introducing personalization and targeting. So even when you go to, the Sacramento Bee, you may see things that are actually tailored to your previous browsing history, which could increase this sort of personalization. So in summary, you're not as much in control of what you know and what you see as you thought you were. The aggregators have a huge role. There's not very many of them. It's going to get more concentrated over time, and so we're going to expect that to change the information we have in society, and it's something that we want to understand and the policy for future work. So thanks.